The carriage wheel struck a stone and threw Alara Whitfield hard against the door, and for one terrible second she thought the driver had seen through her disguise and meant to tip her into the ditch on purpose. She caught her breath, pressed a gloved hand to her chest, and reminded herself of the name she now carried. Margaret Hale. Not Alara. Never Alara again, not until the debt collectors of London forgot her face and the ruined engagement that had chased her out of the city like a hound after a fox. She had left everything behind in 3 days. A letter of recommendation she had forged with a steadier hand than she knew she possessed. A trunk with 2 dresses, a locket, and a small sum of money that would not last the month. And a story, rehearsed so many times on the long road north that she could recite it in her sleep. Margaret Hale, orphaned companion, seeking a quiet post in a quiet house, no family to speak of, no past worth mentioning. Quenby Hall rose out of the mist like something built by giants who had grown tired halfway through and left the rest to the fog. Gray stone, high windows, ivy climbing one wing as though trying to pull the whole building back into the earth. Alara stared up at it through the carriage window and felt something she had not expected. Not fear. Longing. A foolish, aching wish that a place like this could actually become a home, when she knew perfectly well that homes were not for women running from their own names. The carriage rolled to a stop in the gravel drive, and a footman in gray livery opened the door before she had gathered her courage. She stepped down, smoothed her skirts, and looked up at the front steps, where a stout woman in a dark blue dress stood with her hands folded and her chin lifted like a woman inspecting livestock. "You'll be Miss Hale," the woman said. It was not a question. "I am," Alara said, and the lie slid out easier than she expected, though her heart beat so hard she feared the woman could hear it. "I am Mrs. Bellamy, housekeeper of Quenby Hall. Lady Constance is expecting you, though she naps in the afternoons, and you'll do well to remember it. The Duke does not like the household disturbed." The Duke. Alara had read the letter twice before accepting the post, and both times the words had blurred past her like unimportant scenery. A duke who rarely left his estate, a duke who preferred ledgers to London parties. She had pictured an old man, gouty and half-deaf, tucked away in a study somewhere, uninterested in the comings and goings of hired companions. She had not pictured danger. She had not thought to. Mrs. Bellamy led her through a hall lined with portraits. Stern faces in old-fashioned collars watching her pass as though they, too, doubted her name. The air smelled of beeswax and wood smoke, and somewhere deeper in the house, a clock ticked with a patience that made Alara's own nerves feel loud and undignified by comparison. "Lady Constance is the Duke's aunt," Mrs. Bellamy said as they climbed the stairs. "She has been unwell since the winter. She wants company more than nursing, though nobody has managed to convince her physician of that. You'll read to her, walk with her in the garden when the weather allows, and keep her spirits up. Can you manage that, Miss Hale?" "I can," Alara said, and this time the words felt almost true. She had spent years managing her mother's moods before her mother died, coaxing brightness out of a woman who had none left to give. If nothing else, she knew how to sit beside someone and make the room feel less empty. Lady Constance turned out to be a small woman with sharp eyes and a laugh like a cracked bell, propped up on pillows in a bedroom that smelled of lavender and old paper. She looked Alara over from bonnet to boots and declared, with the bluntness of the very old or the very tired, "You look like you have been running from something, my dear." Alara's stomach dropped. "I have been traveling 3 days, my lady. I expect I look like it." Lady Constance did not seem convinced, but she patted the chair beside her bed instead of pressing further, and Alara sat, grateful for the reprieve, telling herself that an old woman's idle observation was nothing to fear. It was over supper, taken alone in a small room off the kitchen because new companions did not dine with the family on their first night, that Alara first heard the servants speak of the Duke, and what she heard settled into her stomach like a stone dropped into still water. "He caught the miller's son red-handed," one of the younger maids was saying to another, voices low but carrying in the quiet room. Everyone thought it was old Hobbs who'd been skimming the grain accounts, but his grace sat with the ledgers 3 whole nights and worked it out, never raised his voice, never accused a soul, until he had the proof laid out plain as daylight. He's magistrate for the whole district, the older maid added, seeing Alara's polite, curious face and mistaking it for simple interest rather than dawning alarm. Has been for near 10 years now. They say he never lets a wrong sit unanswered. Patient as a spider, my mother always called him. Waits and watches until he's certain, and then there's no arguing with what he's found. Alara set down her fork very carefully, as though the small clink of metal against china might give her away. A magistrate, not simply a duke with idle hours to fill, but a man whose entire purpose for 10 years had been separating truth from lies in a district full of both. A man who did not accuse until he was certain. A man who waited. She had imagined herself disappearing into Quenby Hall the way a stone disappears into a lake, one small splash and then stillness. She had not imagined the lake might be watching back. She barely slept that first night, turning over every detail of her forged letters, every gap in the story of Margaret Hale, searching for the places where the seams might show. The letter of recommendation, supposedly written by a family in Bath she had never actually served. The birthplace she had claimed, a village she had only read about in a novel. The dead parents she had invented, whose names she had chosen too quickly and now struggled to remember exactly as she had written them. By morning she had convinced herself she was being foolish. A duke with a district to govern and an ailing aunt to worry over would have no time to interrogate a companion's past. She was one more servant among dozens, unremarkable, unimportant. She dressed carefully, chose the plainest of her 2 gowns, and told herself that plainness was its own kind of armor. She met Lady Constance in the morning room, where the old woman was already awake and demanding to be read to from a book of old ghost stories that Alara privately thought entirely unsuitable for a woman recovering from illness. Though she said nothing and simply began to read, softening the frightening parts as best she could and earning, for her trouble, an amused snort from her employer. "You read well," Lady Constance said when Alara paused for breath. "Better than most companions who come through here. Where did you learn?" "My mother taught me, my lady." That much at least was true, and the truth felt strange and warm in her mouth after so many lies. "And where is your mother now?" "She passed, my lady, some years ago." Lady Constance studied her for a long moment, and Alara held very still under that gaze, the way she imagined a rabbit might hold still under the shadow of a hawk, hoping stillness alone might be mistake for safety. Then the old woman simply nodded and said, "I am sorry for it," and asked her to continue reading, and the moment passed, though Alara's pulse took longer to settle than she would have liked. It was nearly noon when she first saw him. She was crossing the long gallery with a stack of books balanced against her hip, taking the shortest path back to Lady Constance's room, when a door opened ahead of her, and a man stepped out into the corridor with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never in his life needed to hurry for anything. He was tall, dressed in dark, well-made clothes without a hint of ornament, and he moved the way Alara imagined water moved over smooth stone, quiet and inevitable. He was younger than she had expected, younger and far more watchful. Their eyes met, and something in his gaze made the books nearly slip from her arms. "You must be the new companion," he said. His voice was low, even the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to without needing to raise it. "Miss Hale, I believe." "Yes, your grace." She dropped a small curtsy, awkward with the book still balanced against her hip, and felt her face warm with the effort of appearing composed. "Edmund Ashcombe," he said, though of course she knew his name already. Every servant in the house had spoken it in hushed and careful tones since her arrival. "I trust my aunt is treating you kindly." "She is, your grace. She has a great fondness for ghost stories, I've discovered." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough to it that Alara felt an unexpected loosening in her chest. She has always had a taste for the macabre. "It used to trouble my mother terribly." He paused, and his gaze moved over her face with an attention that felt entirely different from Mrs. Bellamy's inspection at the front steps, or Lady Constance's idle curiosity. This was a slower, more deliberate looking, the kind of look a man might give a ledger that did not quite balance. "Hale," he said again, as though testing the shape of the name in his mouth. "That is not a local name. Where do you hail from, Miss Hale?" The question was ordinary enough. Any employer might ask it of a new servant. But something in the careful stillness of his expression, in the way he waited for her answer without impatience, without the small social noises people usually made to fill silence, told Alara that this was not an idle question at all. This was the same patience the maids had described over supper, waiting and watching until he was certain. "Bath, your grace," she said, and heard the small tremor in her own voice and hated herself for it. "Bath," he repeated, "a fine city. I have relations there myself actually, the Farringtons on Milsom Street. Perhaps you crossed paths." Alara's mind raced through the details of her invented history, searching desperately for some safe answer, some way to neither confirm nor deny a connection she had no way of verifying. "I lived a quieter life than that, your grace. My family kept to itself." "Of course." He inclined his head, perfectly courteous, perfectly unreadable, and stepped aside to let her pass. "Forgive me, I did not mean to delay you. My aunt will be wanting her books." "Thank you, your grace." She hurried past him, and it was not until she had turned the corner into the next corridor, out of his sight, that she allowed herself to breathe properly again, and even then her hands shook so badly that one of the books slipped free and struck the floor with a sound like a small clap of thunder. She did not look back to see whether he had heard it. She did not need to. She could feel his attention on her still, the way one feels the warmth of a fire even after stepping out of the room, and she understood, with a cold certainty that settled into her bones and did not leave her for the rest of that long day, that the Duke of Quenby had already begun to notice the small places where her story did not quite fit. That evening, alone in the narrow room she had been given at the end of the servants' corridor, she took out the letter of recommendation she had forged so carefully in London and read it over by candlelight, searching for flaws she had not seen before. The handwriting, she thought, looked convincing enough. The dates lined up, more or less. But the more she stared at it, the more she became certain that a man who caught a thief through 3 sleepless nights of studying ledgers would not be fooled by a single page of invented references, however carefully written. She thought of leaving. She turned the idea over in her mind as she undressed for bed, weighed against the little money she had left, and the long, dangerous road behind her, full of men who might still be looking for the woman who had broken her engagement and vanished with what remained of her family's dignity. Running again meant risking everything a second time, with even less to fall back on than before. Staying meant living under the eye of a man whose entire life's work was catching people exactly like her. She blew out the candle and lay in the dark, listening to the old house settle around her, its wooden bones creaking gently as though it, too, were considering whether to keep her or turn her out. Somewhere below, she could hear the faint, steady sound of a clock striking the hour, patient and unhurried, and she thought of the Duke's voice asking, "Where do you hail from, Miss Hale?" And she understood that she had walked, without knowing it, directly into the one house in England least suited to hiding a secret. But she had nowhere else left to go. And so, with her heart still unsteady and her mind full of half-formed excuses she would need to have ready for tomorrow, Alara Whitfield closed her eyes under a name that was not her own, in a house belonging to a man who had already, she suspected, begun to count the lies. Morning came gray and damp, the kind of light that made the whole world look unfinished, and Alara woke with the memory of the Duke's careful questions still pressing on her chest like a stone. She dressed slowly, choosing her words for the day ahead the way a soldier might choose weapons, and went down to breakfast telling herself that a man as busy as the Duke of Quenby would surely have forgotten a servant's birthplace by morning. She was wrong, though it took 3 more days for her to learn just how wrong. Those 3 days passed in a strange, uneasy rhythm. She read to Lady Constance in the mornings, walked with her in the walled garden when the weather allowed, and spent her afternoons mending linens or copying letters in the small sitting room that had become, almost without her noticing, the one place in the house where she felt something close to peace. Lady Constance was sharp-tongued but kind underneath it, prone to long stories about her youth that wandered pleasantly nowhere in particular, and Alara found herself genuinely fond of the old woman within a week, fonder than she had any right to be, given how quickly she might have to leave. The Duke, for his part, seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. She would hear his voice in the study as she passed, low and even, discussing crop yields with his steward, or catch a glimpse of him crossing the stable yard in the early morning, dressed for riding, his dark hair windswept and his expression unreadable. He did not seek her out again, not directly, and she began to hope that their first meeting in the gallery had been nothing more than ordinary curiosity after all. Then, on the fourth day, Mrs. Bellamy came to find her with an odd, careful look on her face. "His Grace would like a word with you," the housekeeper said. "In his study, now if you please." Ilara's stomach turned to ice. She set down the mending in her lap with hands that did not entirely obey her, and followed Mrs. Bellamy through the long gallery, and down a narrower corridor she had not yet had occasion to walk, past a row of closed doors that seemed, in her nervous state, to watch her pass like the portraits in the front hall. The study door was already open when they arrived. The Duke stood behind a broad desk covered in papers, a ledger open before him, and did not look up immediately when Ilara entered, which gave her a moment to notice the room itself. Shelves of leather-bound books climbing to the ceiling, a fire burning low in the grate despite the mild weather, and laid open on the corner of the desk nearest her, a letter she recognized instantly, with a cold jolt of recognition, as her own letter of recommendation. "Miss Hale," he said, finally looking up, "thank you for coming, please sit." She sat because there was nothing else to do, and folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "I hope you will forgive an old habit of mine," the Duke said, closing the ledger before him with a quiet, deliberate motion. "As magistrate for this district, I have learned to be thorough about the people who come to live under my roof. It is not personal, Miss Hale. I extend the same courtesy to every new member of my household, from the stable boys to the companions my aunt so dearly loves." "Of course, Your Grace." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, and she was grateful for whatever hidden reserve of calm allowed her to meet his eyes without flinching. "I wrote to the family who provided your reference," he said. "The Farringtons of Bath and a Mrs. Hargrove, whose name appears on this letter as your previous employer." The ice in Ilara's stomach spread outward into her chest, her arms, the tips of her fingers. She had known this was possible. She had told herself in the quiet hours before sleep that it was possible, even likely, and yet hearing the words spoken aloud in his calm, unhurried voice felt like the floor tilting beneath her chair. "I have not yet received a reply," the Duke continued, watching her face with an attention so close it felt almost physical, a hand resting lightly but firmly on her shoulder. "The post from Bath can be slow this time of year. I do not doubt it will arrive eventually." "I hope it reaches you soon, Your Grace," Ilara said, and was faintly astonished at her own composure, even as her mind raced through every possible outcome, every lie she might need to tell to explain a reference that would never come, because Mrs. Hargrove did not exist, and no letter addressed to her would ever find its way back to Quenby Hall. "So do I." He leaned back slightly in his chair, and for a moment his expression softened into something almost like curiosity, stripped of its earlier formality. "You read to my aunt beautifully, by the way. Mrs. Bellamy tells me she has not laughed so freely in months. I am grateful for that, whatever else may or may not be settled between us." The kindness in his voice unsettled her more than any accusation could have. She had braced herself for coldness, for the sharp edge of a magistrate closing in on a suspect, and instead she found herself facing a man who seemed genuinely pleased by the comfort she had brought his aunt, even as he calmly, methodically, worked to unravel the lie she had built her new life upon. "Your Grace is very kind," she managed. "I try to be fair," he said. "Fairness and kindness are not always the same thing, Miss Hale, though I hope in most cases they overlap." He rose from his chair, a signal that the interview was ending, and came around the desk to open the door for her himself, an unusual courtesy from a man of his rank. As she passed him, close enough to catch the faint scent of leather and wood smoke that seemed to follow him everywhere, he added, quietly, almost as an afterthought, "I find that people rarely lie about small things without reason, Miss Hale. I confess I am curious what your reason might be. When you are ready to share it, I hope you will trust me with it." She could not answer that. She simply curtsied and walked away as steadily as her shaking legs allowed, and did not breathe properly again until she had shut the door of her own small room behind her and pressed her back against it, as though the wood itself might hold back the weight of everything she had just heard. He knew, or if he did not know precisely, he knew enough. He knew that Margaret Hale was a name assembled out of careful lies, and rather than expose her outright, he had chosen to wait, to watch, to give her room to reveal herself in her own time. It was, she realized with a strange, disorienting mixture of terror and gratitude, exactly the kind of patience the servants had described over supper on her first night. Patient as a spider, waiting until he was certain. The days that followed took on a new and exhausting quality, as though Alara were walking a narrow ledge above a drop she could not see the bottom of. She continued her duties as before, reading to Lady Constance, walking in the garden, mending linens in the small sitting room, but every ordinary moment now carried a second, hidden layer, a constant awareness of the Duke's attention resting somewhere just out of sight, waiting for the post from Bath to arrive and confirm what he already suspected. She began, despite herself, to notice him more closely in return. She noticed that he took his meals early and ate quickly, as though eating were a task to be finished rather than enjoyed, so that he could return to his ledgers and his letters. She noticed that he never raised his voice with the servants, not once, even when a young footman dropped an entire tray of china in the front hall and stood frozen with horror amid the wreckage. The Duke had simply asked, in that same calm, even tone, whether the boy was hurt, and when told he was not, had said only that accidents happened to everyone, and the china could be replaced far more easily than a good footman. She noticed the way Lady Constance's face lit whenever her nephew visited her sick room, how the old woman's sharp tongue softened into something almost girlish in his presence, and how he sat with her for exactly as long as she wished and never once glanced toward the door, as though nothing in the wider world mattered more than the hour he had given her. It became harder with each passing day to think of him only as a threat. On the 7th day since her arrival, a warm afternoon that felt like the first true promise of spring, Alara took Lady Constance's advice and walked alone in the walled garden after her duties were finished, seeking a few private minutes to steady her nerves before supper. She found the Duke there already, standing near an old stone fountain that had long since stopped flowing, his hands clasped behind his back, studying the water as though it might yield up some answer he had been searching for. "Miss Hale," he said without turning, "I did not mean to intrude on your walk." "You are not intruding, Your Grace. This is your garden." A faint, wry smile touched his mouth as he finally turned to face her. "A generous way of putting it. My aunt would tell you I have not set foot in this garden for pleasure in years. I come here to think mostly. It is quiet, and nobody expects me to have an answer ready the moment I arrive." "What sort of answers do you need, Your Grace?" He studied her for a long moment before replying, and Alara had the distinct sense that he was weighing how much of the truth to share, the same careful weighing she recognized so well from her own recent habits. "There has been trouble on the eastern boundary of the estate. Sheep gone missing, fences cut, and no clear culprit, though I have my suspicions. It is the sort of puzzle that keeps a magistrate awake at night, wondering whether he is chasing the wrong thread entirely." "And are you chasing the wrong thread?" "I rarely know until I have followed it to the end," he said. "Patience is not a virtue I chose for myself, Miss Hale. It was forced upon me by a profession that punishes haste severely. I have seen good men accused wrongly because someone acted before they were certain. I would rather wait 100 days too long than accuse a single hour too soon." The words settled over Alara like a warning wrapped inside a comfort, and she understood, standing there in the fading afternoon light with the dead fountain between them, that he was not merely speaking of missing sheep. He was telling her, as plainly as he dared, what kind of man she was dealing with, and why she had not yet been turned out of his house despite the lies stitched through every page of her false history. "Your Grace," she said before she could stop herself, "may I ask you something?" "You may ask. I cannot promise an answer that satisfies you." "If you discovered that someone in your household had lied to you about something important, Would you always uncover the reason before you judge them for it? Something shifted in his expression, subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of understanding passing behind his eyes like a candle catching in a dark room. Always, he said quietly. A lie told out of malice and a lie told out of fear look identical on the surface, Miss Hale. Only a fool judges them the same way. I have spent 10 years learning to tell the difference, and I do not intend to stop now, whatever the cost to my own patience. She held his gaze a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, searching his face for some sign of what he truly believed her lie to be, malice or fear, and found nothing there but that same steady, watchful calm that had unsettled her from the very first day, though it no longer felt entirely like a threat. It felt strangely like an invitation, one she was not yet brave enough to accept. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, "for your patience," and left him standing alone by the dead fountain, his eyes following her all the way back to the house, though she did not turn to see it. That night, lying awake in her narrow bed with the moon casting pale bars of light across the floor, Elara found herself thinking not of the debts that had chased her from London, nor of the ruined engagement that had cost her everything, nor even of the reference letter that would soon, inevitably, expose her false name. She found herself thinking instead of the way the Duke had looked at her by the fountain, as though he were already halfway to forgiving whatever truth he had not yet uncovered, and of how dangerous it was, how utterly foolish, to let herself hope that a magistrate who overlooked nothing might, in the end, choose to overlook her. A fortnight settled over Quenby Hall like a slow, gathering tide, and with it came a rhythm Elara had not expected to find comforting. She rose early, took her breakfast in the small servants' parlor, spent her mornings with Lady Constance, and found, more often than she would have admitted aloud, some excuse to cross paths with the Duke in the late afternoons, when his correspondence was finished and he allowed himself an hour of quiet before supper. Neither of them spoke again of Bath or of Mrs. Hargrove, or of the letter that had still not arrived, though Elara knew the silence could not last forever, and she suspected he knew it too. It was Nora Fenwick, one of the younger housemaids who became, quite without meaning to, Elara's first real friend at Quenby. Nora was quick with her hands and quicker with her tongue, a girl of perhaps 19 with a gift for finding humor in even the dullest chores, and she took to Elara almost immediately, drawn, she confessed one evening while they folded linens together, by the fact that Miss Hale never looked down her nose at the servants the way some companions did. "You'd think the way some of them carry on," Nora said, snapping a sheet straight with a practiced flick of her wrists, "that being a lady's companion made a body royalty. But you're no different from the rest of us, really, are you? Working for your bread same as anyone." "No different at all," Elara agreed, and meant it more than Nora could have known. It was through Nora, 3 days later, that Elara first heard the rumor that turned her blood to ice. They were in the linen room, a small, warm space tucked beneath the eaves that smelled of starch and lavender, when Nora lowered her voice and leaned close, the way girls do when they are about to share something they have been told not to repeat. "There's talk in the village," Nora said. "A man came through asking questions, said he was looking for a young woman traveling alone, came up from London a few weeks back, described her pretty close if you ask me. Fair hair, blue eyes, a London way of speaking even when she tries to soften it." Elara's hands went still over the sheet she was folding. "What sort of man?" "Fine clothes, but not quite fine enough if you take my meaning. The kind that wants to look like quality and doesn't quite manage it. Asked at the inn, asked at the posting house, even asked old Hobbs at the mill, though what Hobbs would know about a runaway lady I couldn't say." Nora shrugged, entirely unaware of the effect her words were having, and went on folding. "Course, half the village thinks it's some romantic tale, a lady running from a wicked husband or some such. The other half thinks she's a thief. Either way, it's the most exciting thing to happen around here since the harvest fire 2 years back." "Did anyone give him an answer?" Elara asked, and was proud of how level her voice remained, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Nobody's seen a stranger woman come through, far as I know. Unless he means one of the maids at the Fenton estate, but she's been there since she was a girl, so that hardly fits." Nora glanced up then, some flicker of Alara's expression finally catching her attention. "You've gone quite pale, Miss Hale. You're not taking ill, are you?" "Only tired," Alara said. "It has been a long week." She excused herself soon after, claiming a headache, and did not stop walking until she reached the privacy of her own small room, where she sat on the edge of her narrow bed with her hands pressed together to keep them from shaking. A man asking questions in the village. Fair hair, blue eyes, a London way of speaking. It could be no one but an agent of her family's creditors, or worse, someone sent by the very man whose broken engagement had set this whole disaster in motion. She had known, when she fled London, that the search for her would not end simply because she had vanished from the city. She had simply hoped it would take longer to find its way to a quiet, remote place like Quenby. She spent that evening in a haze of quiet panic, going through the motions of her duties without truly attending to any of them, so distracted that Lady Constance finally set down her book of ghost stories and fixed Alara with a look far too sharp for an invalid. "You have not heard a word I have said in the last quarter hour," the old woman announced. "Forgive me, my lady. I am not myself this evening." "No," Lady Constance agreed, studying her with an unnerving thoroughness that reminded Alara uncomfortably of the Duke's own careful attention. "You are not. You have looked like a rabbit in a snare since Nora Fenwick came scurrying up from the kitchens with some tale or other, and I am old, my dear, not blind. Something has frightened you." Alara opened her mouth to deny it, some smooth, practiced falsehood already forming on her tongue, but found to her own surprise that she could not quite bring herself to lie again, not to this woman who had shown her nothing but kindness since the day she arrived. "There is a stranger asking questions in the village," she admitted instead, choosing her words with great care. "About a woman who might resemble me. I confess it has unsettled me." "Ah," Lady Constance's sharp eyes softened, just slightly, into something almost sympathetic. "And is there reason for it to unsettle you beyond simple nerves?" The question hung in the air between them, gentle but unmistakably pointed, and Alara understood that Lady Constance, like her nephew, had noticed far more than she had ever let on. But the old woman did not press further when Alara said nothing, only reached out and patted her hand with surprising gentleness. "Whatever it is you are running from, child," Lady Constance said quietly, "you will find no crueler judge under this roof than my nephew, and no kinder one either, once he has satisfied himself of the truth. He does not condemn the frightened for being frightened. He has seen too much of the world for that. Trust him sooner rather than later if you can bring yourself to it. Waiting only makes the telling harder." It was, Alara thought later, lying sleepless in the dark, remarkably close to advice she might have given herself, had she the courage to follow it. The stranger's presence in the village became the quiet, constant undercurrent of the following days, a low hum of unease that Alara could not shake no matter how firmly she told herself she was safe within the walls of Quenby Hall. She began avoiding the windows that faced the drive, half convinced she might glimpse a familiar, unwelcome figure approaching. She began rehearsing excuses again, the way she had on the long road north, in case she needed to explain a sudden departure. And she began, despite every instinct telling her it was foolish, watching for the Duke's presence with something that felt less like fear now, and more like a desperate, unspoken hope that he might somehow shield her from whatever was coming, though she had given him no reason at all to want to. She got her chance to test that hope on a gray, blustery afternoon, when Mrs. Bellamy sent her into the village on an errand for Lady Constance, a matter of fetching a particular tonic from the apothecary that the old woman swore by and refused to do without. Alara took the small pony cart alone, grateful for the fresh air after days spent indoors, and told herself firmly that a quick errand in broad daylight, surrounded by familiar village faces, held no real danger. She was wrong. She had just stepped out of the apothecary's shop, the small bottle of tonic wrapped carefully in brown paper and tucked into her basket, when she saw him across the narrow street. A man in a coat cut fashionably enough to suggest money, though worn at the cuffs in a way that suggested the money had not lasted, his eyes moving over the passers-by with the particular, searching intensity of someone looking for a face he expected to recognize. Ilara's whole body went cold. She knew that walk, that particular set of the shoulders, though she could not immediately place from where, and she did not stay to find out. She turned sharply on her heel and walked in the opposite direction, forcing herself not to run, though every instinct screamed at her to do exactly that. She did not look back until she had reached the pony cart, and by then the street behind her was empty, the stranger gone, whether because he had turned down some other lane or because he had, God help her, seen her face and recognized it at last, she could not say. She drove back to Quenby Hall faster than the narrow country lane strictly allowed, her hands white-knuckled on the reins, her mind racing through every possible consequence of having been seen, if indeed she had been seen at all. She arrived back at the hall flushed and breathless, and it was the Duke himself, crossing the courtyard on his way to the stables, who first noticed her distress and came to meet the cart before she had even fully brought it to a stop. "Miss Hale," he said, and there was something in his voice, some quality of genuine alarm beneath the careful courtesy, that undid the last of her composure entirely. "What has happened?" "Nothing, Your Grace. I am only a poor driver, I fear, and the roads were rougher than expected." The lie came automatically, though her voice shook too badly to make it convincing, and she saw the moment he recognized it for what it was, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger but in the same close, careful attention she had come to know so well. "You are shaking," he said, low enough that the stable hands unloading the cart could not hear, "and you have gone the color of the moon. I do not think this is the roads, Miss Hale." She looked up at him, standing there in the gray afternoon light with his hand extended to help her down from the cart, patient and steady in a way that made the fear crowding her chest suddenly, unbearably heavy, and she found herself, for one dangerous moment, on the very edge of telling him everything. The engagement she had broken, the debts her family had left behind, the false name stitched together out of desperation on a road with no other options left to her. The stranger in the village, whose face she still could not quite place, but whose presence had chased every ounce of safety from the afternoon. There was a man in the village, she said instead, choosing the smallest, safest piece of the truth she could offer. A stranger asking questions. I believe he may have been looking for me, though I cannot say for certain. Something hardened in the Duke's expression, not directed at her, she understood at once, but at the unnamed threat she had just described. "Did he approach you?" "No, Your Grace, I do not believe he saw me at all." "You will not go into the village alone again," he said, and it was not a request, though there was nothing unkind in the firmness of it, only the same steady authority she had heard him use with the frightened footman and the broken china. "Whatever this man wants, I will not have him finding you unguarded on some errand for my aunt's tonics. Do you understand me, Miss Hale?" "Yes, Your Grace," she said, and the strange, unfamiliar comfort of being protected, of having someone stand so plainly and deliberately between her and whatever danger was approaching, brought an unexpected sting of tears to her eyes that she blinked away as quickly as she could manage. He helped her down from the cart at last, his hand steady around hers, and did not release it immediately once her feet were on the ground, though propriety surely demanded he should have. "Whoever he is," the Duke said quietly, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch, "and whatever he wants with you, Miss Hale, I promise you this. He will have to go through me first." She did not know in that moment whether to be comforted or terrified by the promise, for it meant, more clearly than anything he had said before, that he had guessed far more of her secret than she had ever intended him to know, and that he had chosen, in spite of it, to stand on her side of the line rather than against her. It was a kindness she had not earned and did not know how to accept, and it frightened her nearly as much as the stranger in the village had, though for reasons that had nothing at all to do with danger, and everything to do with how badly she had already begun to hope for a future she had no right to claim. The days after the encounter in the village passed under a new and unspoken arrangement, one neither Ilara nor the Duke ever discussed aloud, but which shaped the shifting rhythm of the household all the same. She no longer went beyond the gates without company. A groom accompanied her whenever an errand required the village, and more often than not, she noticed, it was not simply any groom but Davy, a broad, quiet young man the Duke trusted above the others, who seemed to have been given instructions Alara was never told outright, but understood well enough from the way his eyes never strayed far from her whenever they were outside the walls. She told herself this careful watchfulness was simply the Duke discharging his duty as magistrate, a man protecting a member of his household from an unknown threat, nothing more. She told herself this many times, in fact, precisely because she suspected it was not entirely true, and the suspicion frightened her more than the stranger in the village ever had. Meanwhile, the Duke's own investigation into her false references continued in its slow, methodical way, and Alara lived with the knowledge of it the way one lives beside a fire banked low but not extinguished, aware that a single strong wind might send it roaring back to life at any moment. She had taken, in the quiet hours before sleep, to composing the confession she knew she would eventually have to give him, turning the words over and over until they lost all meaning, like a phrase repeated too many times. My name is not Margaret Hale. My name is Alara Whitfield, and I fled London because I broke an engagement that would have ruined me either way, and because my family's debts followed me like a shadow I could not outrun. She rehearsed it in the dark, and each time she woke the next morning without having found the courage to speak it aloud, she told herself there would be time enough tomorrow. It was Lady Constance, in the end, who nearly forced the matter, though not through any deliberate cruelty on her part. They were sitting together in the walled garden on a mild, sunlit afternoon, Lady Constance wrapped in shawls despite the gentle warmth, watching a pair of finches quarrel over a patch of newly turned earth, when the old woman set down her embroidery and said, without any preamble at all, "My nephew has written to Bath a second time." Alara's needle stilled over the handkerchief she had been hemming. "Has he, my lady?" "He has. Twice now, and received no reply either time, which he finds curious, given that the Farringtons of Milsom Street are, in fact, cousins of ours and quite reliable correspondents as a rule." Lady Constance did not look at her as she spoke, keeping her eyes fixed instead on the quarreling finches, though Alara had the distinct impression the old woman missed nothing at all. "He has not said as much to me directly, but I have known Edmund since he was in short coats, my dear, and I know the particular quiet he falls into when he has puzzled something through nearly to its end, and is only waiting, out of some misplaced sense of fairness, to let the other party arrive at the truth on their own terms rather than have it dragged out of them." Alara said nothing, her hands trembling slightly around the half-finished hem, and Lady Constance finally turned to look at her directly, her sharp old eyes softened by something that looked, unmistakably, like affection. "I do not know what you are hiding, Miss Hale, and I confess I have stopped much caring what your true name might be. You have been kinder to me these past weeks than my own grandchildren manage in a 12-month, and I have grown quite fond of you, foolish as that may be for a woman my age to admit to a servant she has known so briefly. But I have lived a long time, and I have seen what happens to secrets left too long in the dark. They do not shrink. They grow and fester, and eventually burst forth in some manner far uglier and more painful than if they had simply been spoken aloud in the light, on the teller's own terms, while there was still kindness left to receive them. "I am afraid, my lady," Alara admitted quietly, the words slipping free before she could stop them, the closest she had come to honesty since arriving at Quenby Hall. "I do not know how to tell him without losing everything I have found here." "And what do you imagine you have found here exactly?" Lady Constance asked, not unkindly, though the question landed with the precision of a blade nonetheless. Alara did not answer. She could not, without admitting a truth even more dangerous than her false name, and Lady Constance, watching the color rise in her companion's cheeks, allowed herself a small, knowing smile and returned her attention to the finches, as though she had not just laid bare the very heart of the matter with a single well-aimed question. That evening, as if fate itself had grown impatient with Alara's hesitation, the crisis she had been dreading finally arrived, though not in the form she had expected. She was crossing the front hall on her way to fetch Lady Constance's evening tonic when a sharp knock sounded at the great front doors, urgent and insistent in a way that made every servant within earshot pause and glance toward the sound. Price, the butler, moved to answer it with his usual unhurried dignity, and Alara, some instinct prickling along her spine, found herself lingering near the base of the stairs rather than continuing on her errand, though she could not have said exactly why. The man who stood on the front steps when Price opened the door was the same man Alara had glimpsed across the village street days before, the coat with its worn cuffs, the searching, hungry look in his eyes, though up close, in the warm light spilling from the hall, she recognized him at last, and the recognition struck her like a physical blow. Gerald Finch, her father's man of business, or what remained of him after her father's death had left the family's affairs in ruin. A man who had once seemed merely unpleasant and now, standing on the Duke's front steps with an air of grim determination, seemed something far more dangerous. "I am looking for a woman traveling under a false name," Finch announced, his voice carrying easily across the hall, loud enough that Alara, frozen at the foot of the stairs, felt every syllable land against her like a blow. "Fair hair, blue eyes, London bred. I have reason to believe she is employed in this household, and I have come to collect what is owed to me on her family's account." Price, to his credit, did not so much as blink at the accusation. "This is a respectable household, sir. I am not aware of any servant here traveling under a false name, and I must ask you to state your business more plainly or take your leave." "Her name," Finch said, his voice rising with the particular ugly confidence of a man who believed he already held the winning hand, "is Alara Whitfield, daughter of the late Charles Whitfield, whose debts I have been engaged to recover for the better part of a year. I have followed her trail from London to this very village, and I do not intend to leave without her." The name struck the hall like a dropped bell, and Alara felt every eye that had gathered, servants drawn by the commotion, turned slowly toward her where she stood frozen at the foot of the stairs, her false identity crumbling in an instant, far sooner and far more publicly than she had ever imagined it would. It was the Duke's voice, calm and cutting through the sudden silence like a blade through still water, that broke the moment. "That is quite enough." He had appeared unnoticed at the top of the stairs, and now descended with the same unhurried, deliberate pace Alara had come to recognize as entirely his own. A man who never rushed because rushing suggested a loss of control. He simply did not permit himself. He crossed the hall to stand beside Alara, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her shoulder, and fixed Gerald Finch with a look so cold and so precisely measured that the man's earlier confidence visibly faltered. "I am the magistrate of this district," the Duke said, "and I will thank you not to make accusations on my doorstep that you cannot substantiate. If you have a legitimate claim against a debt, sir, you will present it through the proper channels in the proper court before the proper authority, which happens, by no small coincidence, to be myself. You will not shout names across my front hall like a fishwife hawking her wares, frightening my household and disturbing my aunt's rest. Do I make myself understood?" Finch's mouth worked for a moment, some protest rising and then dying under the Duke's unwavering stare. "Your Grace, I only meant." "I know precisely what you meant." The Duke's voice did not rise, did not sharpen, and yet it carried a weight that silenced the man completely. "You meant to frighten a young woman into compliance through public humiliation, rather than pursue whatever claim you believe you have through legal means, because you suspected, correctly, that the proper channels would require rather more proof than you currently possess. I suggest you return to wherever you have taken lodgings, sir, and consider very carefully whether you wish to press this matter further, because I promise you, if you do, I will examine every particular of your claim with the same thoroughness I extend to every case that comes before me, and I do not think you will find that scrutiny comfortable." Finch retreated down the front steps under the combined weight of the Duke's stare and the sudden, unified silence of the assembled household, muttering something about returning with proper papers, and Price closed the great door behind him with a finality that seemed to echo through the whole hall. For a long moment nobody moved. Then, one by one, the servants who had gathered began to disperse, murmuring among themselves, casting curious, uncertain glances back toward Alara, whose false name had just been stripped away in front of every one of them, and who stood now beside the Duke with her whole body trembling, uncertain whether she was about to be turned out into the night or something else entirely. "Come," the Duke said quietly, his hand coming to rest, light but unmistakably steady at the small of her back. "Not here. My study." She followed him, past the curious, whispering servants, up the stairs and down the familiar corridor to the study where he had first questioned her weeks before. And when the door closed behind them at last, sealing them both inside the quiet, fire-lit room, she found she had no strength left to maintain any pretense at all. "I am sorry," she said, the words breaking free at last after weeks of careful rehearsal, though none of the versions she had practiced sounded anything like the raw, unguarded confession that spilled out of her now. "My name is Alara Whitfield. I broke an engagement that would have ruined my family's good name entirely, to a man I could not bring myself to marry, and when my father died soon after, his debts came due all at once, and Gerald Finch was sent to collect them, and I had nothing left to give him, so I ran. I came here under a false name because I did not know what else to do, and I have lied to you and to your aunt and to every soul in this house since the day I arrived, and I understand entirely if you wish me to leave tonight." The Duke was silent for a long moment, standing near the fire with his back half turned to her, and Alara braced herself in the terrible quiet that followed, for the cold, formal dismissal she felt certain was coming. Instead, when he finally turned to face her, his expression held nothing of the anger she had expected, only a strange, careful gentleness that undid her completely. "Alara," he said, testing the true name the way he had once tested the false one, and something in the sound of it, spoken so quietly and so deliberately in his own voice, brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Sit down. I have a great many questions, and I think, for both our sakes, it is time we finally answered them honestly." She sat because he asked her to, in the same chair she had occupied weeks before when he had first mentioned the letter to Bath, and this time she told him everything, without pause, without softening any part of it. She told him of her engagement to a man named Lord Alastair Vane, arranged by her father in the last desperate years before his death, a match that had promised to settle the family's mounting debts in exchange for her hand. She told him how she had discovered, only weeks before the wedding, the true nature of the man she was to marry, a coldness beneath his charm that had frightened her more than poverty ever had, and how she had broken the engagement in the full knowledge that doing so would ruin whatever remained of her family's reputation and leave the debts entirely unresolved. She told him of her father's death soon after, sudden and unexpected, and of Gerald Finch arriving at her door within the week, papers in hand, demanding payment she had no means to provide. She told him of the 3 frantic days in which she had packed what little she could carry, invented a name and a history out of desperation, and fled north with no plan beyond simply putting distance between herself and everything that threatened to crush her. The Duke listened without interrupting, his expression grave and attentive, and when she finally fell silent, spent and trembling, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "You broke an engagement that would have secured your family's fortune," he said slowly, "because the man himself frightened you. Not because of scandal, or vanity, or a change of heart over some trivial matter, but because you saw something in him that troubled you deeply enough to risk everything rather than marry him." "Yes, Your Grace." "That was not cowardice, Alara. Whatever your father's creditors may call it, and whatever this Finch fellow hopes to convince the world of, it was not cowardice." His voice carried a quiet intensity that surprised her, and he crossed the room to stand nearer the fire, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture she had come to associate with his most careful thinking. "I have sat in judgment over a great many cases in 10 years as magistrate, and I have learned this above all else. The law is very good at punishing debt and very poor at understanding fear. You did not steal from anyone. You did not commit any crime beyond changing your name to survive, which is no crime at all, whatever Finch would like this district to believe. He said I owe him money, Your Grace, my father's debts." "Your father's debts," the Duke said, with the same precise coldness he had turned on Finch in the front hall. Are your father's debts, not yours, and English law is considerably clearer on that point than Mr. Finch appears willing to admit. He has no legitimate claim on your person, whatever papers he waves about, and I intend to examine those papers with great care before I permit him anywhere near this household again." He paused, studying her with an expression that had softened considerably from the formal magistrate's mask she had grown accustomed to. "Why did you not simply tell me this from the beginning?" "Because I was afraid," she said honestly. "Afraid you would send me away the moment you learned the truth. Afraid of being exposed as a liar in front of a man whose entire life's work is catching exactly such lies." Something that might almost have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it did not quite reach his eyes, which remained fixed on her with an intensity that made her chest ache. "I have known for some time that Margaret Hale was not your true name, Alara. I suspected it within the first week, if I am honest, and I have spent every week since gathering enough of the truth to be certain, precisely so that when this moment came, I would already know how to answer it fairly." He drew a slow breath, as though weighing whether to say what came next. "I did not press you sooner because I did not wish to frighten away someone who had brought more genuine warmth into this house in a month than it has seen in years. My aunt adores you. The servants speak well of you. And I have found myself, against every rule of prudence a magistrate ought to observe, rather reluctant to see you go." The confession, quiet and unguarded, hung between them in the firelit room, and Alara felt something in her chest crack open, some long-held tension finally releasing after weeks of careful fear. "You are not angry with me." "I am relieved," he said simply. "I have spent a month wondering what secret a woman with such gentle hands and such careful eyes could possibly be hiding, and I confess the truth, now that I have it, seems a far lighter burden than the imagined alternatives I have turned over in my mind at 3 in the morning." She laughed then, a small, surprised sound that carried more relief than humor, and the Duke's careful composure finally broke into something like a real smile, brief but unmistakable, the first she had seen from him since her arrival. "What happens now, Your Grace?" she asked, when the moment had settled into something quieter. "Now," he said, "you remain at Quenby Hall, under whatever name you choose to use, while I deal properly with Mr. Finch, and whatever fabricated claim he intends to bring before me. I will not have you frightened out of this house by a man trading on debts that are not legally yours to carry." He hesitated, and for the first time since she had known him, something like uncertainty crossed his composed features. "And perhaps, in time, once this matter is settled, you might permit me to know you properly, Alara Whitfield, rather than the careful fiction of Margaret Hale." The warmth that spread through her at those words frightened her nearly as much as Finch's arrival had, for it carried a hope she had not allowed herself in a very long time, the dangerous, fragile hope that a future built on honesty might actually be possible for her here, in this gray stone house, under the watchful eye of a man who had chosen patience over judgment at every turn. But hope, she would soon learn, was rarely permitted to settle undisturbed for long. It was 3 days later, on a wild and stormy evening that seemed to mirror the sudden turmoil gathering again over Quenby Hall, that the danger Alara had thought resolved returned with far greater force than before. She was returning from Lady Constance's room, later than usual, having stayed to read through a particularly frightening chapter twice at the old woman's insistence, when she smelled smoke, faint at first, then unmistakably stronger, drifting from the direction of the east wing where the old nursery and several disused guest rooms stood largely forgotten. She did not think. She simply ran toward it, calling out as she went, and found, rounding the final corner into the east wing corridor, thick gray smoke pouring from beneath a closed door, and beyond it, the unmistakable orange flicker of flame licking hungrily at old, dry timber. "Fire!" She screamed, the word tearing from her throat with a force she had not known she possessed, and within moments the whole house seemed to erupt into motion around her, servants pouring from every direction with buckets and blankets, Mrs. Bellamy's voice rising sharp and commanding above the chaos, and through it all, the Duke arriving at a dead run, his usual careful composure entirely abandoned, his eyes finding Alara first. checking her for injury with a single desperate glance, before turning his full attention to the spreading blaze. "Get everyone clear," he ordered, already tearing off his coat to beat at the nearest flames, "and someone fetch water from the courtyard well quickly." The next quarter-hour passed in a blur of smoke and shouted orders, and the terrible, roaring heat of fire fought back inch by desperate inch. Buckets passed hand to hand in a chain that stretched from the well to the burning corridor, until at last the flames guttered, smothered under wet blankets and sheer, exhausted determination, leaving behind a ruined room and a corridor thick with acrid smoke, but, mercifully, no worse harm than a few singed hands and streaming eyes. It was only once the danger had passed, once the household had begun the long work of assessing the damage and airing out the smoke-filled corridors, that anyone thought to ask how the fire had started, and it was Davy, the young groom, who found the answer, half melted in the ashes of the ruined room. The remains of a lantern that had no business being there at all, its glass shattered in a way that suggested it had been thrown rather than dropped. The Duke examined the wreckage himself, his expression darkening into something Alara had not yet seen from him, a cold, focused fury entirely different from his usual careful calm. "This was no accident," he said quietly, turning the ruined lantern over in his soot-blackened hands. "Someone set this deliberately." Alara, standing beside him in the smoke-stained corridor with her heart still hammering from the fear of the fire, felt a fresh, colder fear settle over her as understanding dawned. "Finch," she said. "Finch," the Duke agreed grimly, "or someone acting on his behalf, a man frightened enough by the prospect of losing his claim against you to resort to burning down my house rather than let the matter proceed through proper channels." He set the ruined lantern down with careful, controlled precision, though Alara could see the tightness in his jaw, the barely restrained anger beneath his composure. "This ends now. Whatever proof he thinks he can extort out of fear, I will see him answer for this in a court of law, and I will see it done before he has the chance to endanger this household again." She reached out without quite meaning to, and took his soot-streaked hand in both of hers, an act of comfort she would never have dared a month before, and he did not pull away, only turned his hand to hold hers back, his grip warm and steady despite the chaos of the evening still settling around them. "You are not alone in this," he said quietly, echoing, though neither of them said it aloud, the promise he had made her days before in the courtyard. "Whatever comes next, Alara, you will not face it alone." Standing there in the ruined, smoke-filled corridor, her hand held fast in his, Alara allowed herself, for the first time since fleeing London, to believe him. The morning after the fire brought with it a grim, businesslike urgency that swept through Quenby Hall like a fresh wind clearing out smoke. The Duke rode out before breakfast, accompanied by two of his most trusted grooms, and a letter of authority that would allow him to bring the full weight of the law down upon Gerald Finch. And Alara spent the hours of his absence in a state of restless, anxious waiting that made even Lady Constance's usually diverting company feel thin and insufficient. He returned by midday with news that turned Alara's fear into something colder and more complicated. Finch had fled the village in where he had taken lodgings sometime in the night, leaving behind only a hastily abandoned trunk and an unpaid bill, and no one in the surrounding villages had seen which direction he had gone. "He has gone to ground," the Duke said grimly, pacing the length of his study while Alara sat with her hands clenched tightly in her lap, "which tells me he knows precisely how much trouble he is in, and precisely how little legitimate claim he ever truly had. A man confident in his rights does not vanish in the night after setting a fire." "What if he comes back?" Alara asked, the question she had been turning over in dread since waking that morning. "What if he tries again, and this time someone is hurt? Then he will answer for arson as well as fraud, and I will see him transported for it if the evidence supports the charge." The Duke stopped his pacing and came to sit beside her, close enough that his knee nearly brushed hers, an intimacy that would have scandalized Mrs. Bellamy had she witnessed it, though neither of them seemed inclined to care in that moment. "I have sent word to the constables in the neighboring districts, and to the magistrates of the towns along the northern road, describing him and the charges against him. He will find it a great deal harder to hide than he expects," Alara. This is not London, where a man can vanish into a crowd. In this county, word travels faster than any man can ride. She wanted badly to believe him, and for 3 quiet days that followed, it seemed as though his confidence had been justified. No further word came of Finch, no strange men appeared in the village asking questions, and the household began, slowly, to settle back into its familiar rhythms. The burned room in the east wing boarded over and left for later repair. The fear of that terrible night receding, day by day, into something closer to memory than immediate threat. It was during those quiet days that something else began to grow between Alara and the Duke, something neither of them named aloud but which both of them seemed, by unspoken agreement, to be nurturing with great care. He began seeking her out in the evenings, not for questioning now but simply for company, and she found herself looking forward to those hours with an eagerness she had not allowed herself to feel for anyone in a very long time. They spoke of ordinary things at first, books they had both read, memories of childhood, the small daily concerns of running an estate as large and complicated as Quenby, and slowly, carefully of deeper things as well. Her mother's death and the loneliness that had followed it. His own father's harsh, exacting nature which had shaped him. He admitted one evening into a man who trusted evidence over instinct because instinct, in his childhood home, had so often been punished as insufficient. "My father believed a man's word meant nothing without proof to back it," he told her one evening, as they sat together in the small sitting room where Alara had once done her mending, a fire crackling low in the grate between them. "He taught me to doubt everything, including myself, unless I could demonstrate it beyond question. It made me a careful magistrate, I think. It also made me, for a great many years, a rather lonely man." "You do not seem lonely now," Alara said softly. He looked at her then with an expression so open, so entirely without his usual careful guard, that her breath caught in her chest. "No," he agreed. "I do not." It was on the 4th evening after the fire, as this fragile new closeness continued to deepen between them, that Lady Constance, watching the two of them from her armchair with the sharp, satisfied eyes of a woman who had suspected precisely this outcome from the very beginning, finally spoke the thought that had clearly been forming in her mind for days. "You know," she said, apropos of nothing, interrupting a comfortable silence that had settled over the sitting room, "my late husband once told me that the surest sign a man has fallen in love is that he stops being careful. Edmund has been careful his entire life, Miss Whitfield. Careful with his words, careful with his trust, careful, above all, with his heart. I have watched him grow considerably less careful these past weeks, and I confess I find it a great relief." "Aunt Constance," the Duke said, a flush of color rising unexpectedly to his composed features, the first time Alara had ever seen him genuinely flustered, "I do not think this is the moment." "Nonsense. There is never a proper moment for old women to hold their tongues, my dear boy, and I have far too little time left to waste any of it on tact." Lady Constance's sharp eyes softened as she looked between the two of them, and her voice, when she continued, carried a rare and unguarded warmth. "I have watched this house go quiet and cold since your mother passed, Edmund, and I confess I had begun to fear it would remain that way. But I have not heard this many footsteps hurrying toward the sitting room in the evenings, nor this much genuine laughter echoing through these halls, in a very long time. Whatever name this young woman first came to us under, I think we can all agree she has brought something back to Quenby that was sorely missing." Alara felt her own face warm under the weight of the old woman's words, and beside her the Duke reached out, quite deliberately, quite openly, and took her hand in his, a gesture he had never before made in front of witnesses. "She has," he agreed quietly, his eyes never leaving Alara's face. "More than my aunt knows." It was, Alara thought, sitting there with her hand held fast in his and Lady Constance beaming at them both with unabashed satisfaction, the closest she had come in years to something that felt, unmistakably, like happiness, fragile and hard one, and entirely undeserved by any measure of the world's usual justice, and yet real all the same. She allowed herself, for one precious evening, to believe that the danger had truly passed, and that whatever came next for her, and for this careful, patient man who had chosen understanding over judgment, it might finally be something gentle. She was wrong to believe the danger had passed entirely, though she would not learn how wrong until 3 days later, when Gerald Finch returned to Quenby Hall for the final time, no longer alone, and no longer content to threaten from a safe distance. He came at dusk, when the household was least prepared for trouble, riding up the drive with 2 rough-looking companions at his side, and a bundle of papers clutched in his fist as though they were a weapon in themselves. Alara was walking with Lady Constance in the garden when Nora came running across the lawn, her cap askew and her face white with alarm, calling out that Mr. Finch had returned, and that he had brought men with him, and that Mrs. Bellamy had already sent for his grace. "Take my aunt inside," Alara said to Nora, with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, "and lock the garden door behind you. I will not have her frightened by this." "And what of you, my dear?" Lady Constance protested, gripping Alara's arm with surprising strength for a woman so recently ill. "I will not leave you out here alone with that man." "I am not alone," Alara said, glancing toward the house, where she could already see the Duke striding across the courtyard, his expression set in the same cold, controlled fury she had seen the night of the fire. "Please, my lady, let Nora take you in." "I promise I will follow directly." Lady Constance allowed herself to be led away, though not without a final, fierce glance back over her shoulder, and Alara turned to face the front of the house alone, her heart pounding, as Finch and his 2 companions came to a halt in the graveled drive, the Duke arriving to meet them at almost the same moment. "I have brought proof," Finch announced, brandishing his bundle of papers with the same ugly confidence he had shown before, though there was a new, desperate edge to his voice now, the sound of a man who knew his position was crumbling and had chosen recklessness over retreat. "Signed papers, Your Grace, proving the debt owed by the Whitfield estate, and proving further that this woman conspired to defraud her creditors by fleeing under a false identity. I have witnesses, sworn statements, everything a court would need to see her transported for fraud, unless she agrees here and now to satisfy the debt through other means." "Other means," the Duke repeated, his voice deadly quiet, and Alara understood with a fresh wave of revulsion exactly what Finch was suggesting. The same cruel arrangement that had first driven her to flee London in the first place, marriage or ruin, offered now with the added threat of criminal charges hanging over her head. "You would have her marry you, or one of these men you have brought, in exchange for papers you likely forged yourself, rather than pursue any legitimate claim through the courts." "I would have what is owed to me," Finch snapped, "one way or another, and I do not much care which way that turns out to be." "Then let us examine these papers properly," the Duke said, extending his hand with a calm that seemed, to Alara's ears, almost more frightening than open anger would have been. "If your claim is legitimate, sir, you have nothing to fear from a magistrate's careful review. If it is not, I suggest you consider very seriously what penalty attaches to forging debt instruments and attempting to extort a marriage through threat of false imprisonment, because I promise you, I know that penalty intimately, and it is considerably harsher than whatever sum you imagine yourself owed." Finch hesitated, his confidence visibly wavering under the Duke's steady, unblinking stare, and in that hesitation, Alara saw the truth she had suspected all along, that the papers he carried were exactly what the Duke had guessed them to be, hastily assembled fictions meant to frighten a frightened woman into compliance, never intended to survive genuine legal scrutiny. "Give me the papers, Finch," the Duke said again, his hand still extended, "or leave my property immediately, and know that either choice you make tonight, I will have men riding for the county sheriff within the hour regardless." It was one of Finch's companions, a heavy-set man with a face like weathered leather, who broke first, muttering something about not having signed on for arson charges, and turning his horse back toward the road without waiting for further instruction. The second companion hesitated only a moment longer before following, leaving Finch alone in the drive, his bundle of false papers still clutched uselessly in his fist, his earlier bravado collapsing visibly under the weight of his own abandoned scheme. "This is not finished," he spat, backing his horse away from the Duke's advancing figure. I will find another way to see her answer for what her family owes." "You will find no such thing," the Duke said, "because I intend to see you brought before a proper court myself, on charges of fraud, attempted extortion, and arson, and I promise you, Mr. Finch, that when the truth of your forged papers comes to light, no magistrate in this county will show you the patience I have already wasted on your account." He took one step closer, his voice dropping lower still, carrying a warning Alara felt in her very bones. "Leave now, while you still have the chance to leave at all." Finch stared at him a moment longer, some last, desperate calculation working behind his eyes, and then, with a final muttered curse, wheeled his horse around and galloped off down the drive after his fleeing companions, leaving nothing behind but the settling dust and the ragged, uneven sound of Alara's own breathing, as the fear of the last several minutes finally began to drain out of her. The Duke turned to her immediately, closing the distance between them in 3 quick strides, his hands coming up to steady her by the shoulders as though he feared she might collapse where she stood. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you before I arrived?" "No," she said, though her voice shook badly. "No, he only spoke." "It was enough." "It was more than enough," the Duke said grimly. And then, in a gesture that surprised them both, he drew her into his arms entirely, holding her close against his chest in the fading evening light. And Alara, past the point of caring what any watching servant might think of such an open display, allowed herself to lean into that embrace and simply breathe, safe at last, or safer than she had felt in longer than she could remember. "I sent riders after him the moment I saw him approach," the Duke murmured into her hair. "He will not reach the county line before the sheriff's men find him. This is finished, Alara. Whatever else comes, this particular fear is finished." She wanted desperately to believe him, and in the days that followed, as word reached Quenby Hall that Gerald Finch had indeed been apprehended attempting to flee north, his forged papers confiscated as evidence, his 2 accomplices already turning testimony against him in exchange for leniency of their own, she allowed herself, slowly and carefully, to believe it at last. It was several evenings later, once the household had finally settled back into something resembling ordinary calm, that the Duke came to find Alara in the walled garden, where she had taken to sitting near the old, dry fountain that had become, over the weeks, something like a favorite refuge. He sat beside her on the low stone bench without asking permission, a familiarity that would have startled her a month before and now felt entirely natural. And for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply watching the last light of evening fade behind the garden wall. "I owe you an explanation," he said finally, "for something I have not yet told you, about why I chose patience with you from the very beginning, rather than the swift judgment my position would have entitled me to." Alara turned to look at him, curious at the sudden gravity in his tone. "You do not owe me anything, Your Grace. You have already given me far more than I had any right to expect." "Perhaps, but I think you deserve to understand why, all the same." He drew a slow breath, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, as though the memory he was about to share required some effort to summon. "My mother was not always the Duchess of Quenby, Alara. She came to my father's family under circumstances not entirely unlike your own, though the particulars differed. Her own father had left considerable debts behind him, and there were those in London society who believed, quite wrongly, that she had married my father for the fortune alone, to escape those debts rather than for any genuine affection. The rumors followed her for years. My father's own relations treated her coldly for the better part of a decade, convinced she had schemed her way into a title she did not deserve, until she died still bearing the weight of suspicions she had never done anything to earn." Alara's chest tightened with a sympathy that surprised her in its intensity. "I am sorry, Your Grace. That must have been very painful for you to witness, as a boy." "It taught me something I have never forgotten," he said. "That the world is far quicker to judge a woman's desperation than it is to understand it, and that a fortune or a title changes nothing about how easily a frightened person can be mistaken for a scheming one. I watched my mother suffer under suspicions that were never properly examined, never given the fair hearing she deserved, and I promised myself, long before I ever became magistrate of this district, that I would never repeat that same injustice against anyone under my protection, whatever the circumstances that brought them to my door." He turned to look at her fully now, his expression open and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen from him. "When I first suspected your name was false, Alara, I thought of my mother immediately. I thought of how easily the world had condemned her without ever asking why, and I resolved that whatever your reasons turned out to be, I would ask first, and judge only after, if judgment was warranted at all." "It was never a scheme," Alara said softly. "I want you to know that. I never sought out this house, or your protection, or anything more than a quiet place to hide until the danger passed." "I know that now," he said. "I believe I have known it for some time if I am honest with myself, but I wanted you to understand why I chose to wait, rather than confront you outright, from that very first meeting in the gallery. It was never simply the patience of a careful magistrate, Alara. It was the patience of a son who watched his mother suffer for want of exactly the fairness I hoped to offer you instead." The confession settled over her with a quiet, powerful weight, and Alara found herself reaching for his hand without quite deciding to do so, her fingers threading through his in the fading evening light. "Thank you," she said, "for that fairness. I do not think I have ever been given it so freely before by anyone." "You deserve considerably more than fairness," the Duke said, his voice low and steady, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I have spent these past weeks watching you bring warmth back into a house that had grown far too quiet, watching you care for my aunt as though she were your own family, watching you face down a threat that would have broken far stronger people. And I find, Alara Whitfield, that I do not wish to spend a single day going forward without you somewhere near me." She could not speak, for a moment, past the sudden fullness in her throat, and he seemed to understand her silence for what it was, taking her other hand as well so that both were clasped now within his own. "I am not asking you to answer tonight," he said gently. "I know you have carried enough fear and enough loss these past months to need time before you trust anything as fragile as happiness. But I wanted you to know, plainly and without any further careful waiting on my part, that whatever future you choose to build, here at Quenby or elsewhere, I would very much like to be part of it if you will have me." The garden had grown nearly dark around them by the time Alara finally found her voice again, and when she spoke, it was with a certainty that surprised her, born not of impulse, but of the slow, steady trust that had grown between them across every careful, patient week since her arrival. "I have spent so long," she said, "under a name that was not my own, in fear of a truth I was certain would cost me everything the moment it was known. And you are the first person, Edmund, who looked at that truth when it finally came out and chose to see me more clearly for it, rather than less." She tightened her grip on his hands, her own voice steadying with every word. "I do not need more time to know what I want to stay. Not as Margaret Hale, hiding from the world, but as myself, entirely, for the first time in longer than I can remember." What followed was not a grand declaration, nor a dramatic embrace beneath the darkening sky, though there was tenderness enough in the quiet way he drew her hand to his lips, and warmth enough in the smile that broke across his face, unguarded and genuine, that Alara understood she had finally, after so many months of running, found a place where her true name was not a danger to be hidden but a truth to be welcomed. Gerald Finch stood trial at the county assizes some 6 weeks later, and Alara, at the Duke's steady insistence, attended every day of the proceedings, determined to see the matter through to its end rather than let fear keep her hidden away as it had for so many months before. The forged papers, once examined by men trained precisely to spot such things, fell apart under scrutiny with an ease that made Alara wonder, in hindsight, how she had ever feared them so deeply. Finch's 2 former companions gave testimony against him in exchange for lighter sentences of their own, describing in plain, damning detail how the debt papers had been fabricated from whole cloth, how the fire in the East Wing had been set at Finch's own direction in a desperate bid to frighten Alara into compliance before the truth of his fraud could be properly examined. The judge, a stern but fair man who had clearly heard of the Duke's own careful reputation and seemed inclined to trust his account of events, handed down a sentence that saw Finch transported for his crimes, a fate Alara found she could regard, once it was finally settled, with more relief than lingering fear. She returned to Quenby Hall that evening lighter than she had felt in over a year, the last thread of her old life finally severed cleanly, and found Lady Constance waiting for her in the front hall with an expression of such open delight that Alara nearly laughed aloud despite the gravity of the day. "It is finished, then," the old woman said, taking both of Alara's hands in her own. "Truly finished." "Truly finished," Alara confirmed, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones at last. The Duke, standing just behind his aunt with an expression that mingled relief and something warmer still, came forward to take Alara's hand from Lady Constance's grasp, and led her, with a gentleness that had become entirely familiar to her now, toward the study where so much of their careful, complicated understanding had first been built. "I have a question for you," he said, once the door had closed behind them, "and I find, after everything we have weathered together these past months, that I no longer have any patience left for waiting on the proper moment to ask it." Alara felt her heart begin to race, though this time the racing carried nothing of the old fear, only a bright, unfamiliar anticipation. "Ask it then." He knelt there in the firelit study, taking both her hands in his with the same steady care he had shown her from that very first meeting in the gallery weeks before, when she had still believed herself nothing more than a frightened stranger passing briefly through his household. "Alara Whitfield," he said, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not Margaret Hale, not any borrowed name meant to protect you from a world too quick to judge, but yourself, entirely and honestly, for the whole of both our lives." She did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, and the word carried none of the careful, guarded weight her every other answer at Quenby Hall had once demanded of her, only a simple, overwhelming certainty. "Yes, Edmund. 1,000 times yes." Their wedding took place at Quenby Hall in the early days of summer, a smaller affair than many dukes might have arranged, but warm and genuine in a way Alara suspected far grander celebrations rarely managed. Lady Constance, recovered enough by then to stand for most of the ceremony without assistance, wept openly through the vows and declared afterward, to anyone who would listen, that she had known from the very first week that her nephew's careful heart had finally found someone worth losing his caution over. Nora Fenwick, promoted by then to Alara's own lady's maid, cried nearly as hard as Lady Constance and insisted, with great seriousness, that she had suspected the match from the moment she first saw the Duke's eyes follow Alara across the front hall on her very first afternoon at Quenby. As for Alara herself, standing in the old stone chapel with her hand clasped in Edmund's, and the whole gathered household watching with unmistakable warmth, she found herself thinking not of the frightened woman who had arrived at Quenby Hall under a borrowed name, trembling in a rattling carriage and rehearsing lies she had never wanted to tell, but of everything that name had ultimately led her toward. A household that had come to feel like family, an old woman whose sharp wit had become one of her dearest comforts, and a man whose entire life's work had taught him to seek truth patiently, gently, and without cruelty, and who had extended that same rare gift to her from the very first uncertain day of her arrival. She had come to Quenby Hall believing that hiding was the only path left open to her, that her true name carried nothing but danger and ruin wherever it was spoken. She left that chapel, hand in hand with the man who had seen through every careful lie and chosen understanding over judgment at every turn, as herself entirely, and understood at last that the truth she had feared for so long had only ever been waiting for the right person patient enough to receive it. The first winter of their marriage brought heavy snow to Quenby, drifts piling high against the garden wall where the old fountain stood, and Alara found herself, on quiet evenings, still marveling at how completely her life had changed in the space of a single year. She had arrived at this house a frightened stranger clutching a false name like a shield, and now she moved through its corridors as its mistress, greeted warmly by servants who had watched her transformation from nervous companion to duchess, with an affection that never failed to humble her. Lady Constance, though her health remained fragile, seemed to draw new strength from the marriage she had so plainly hoped for, and spent her mornings that winter teaching Alara the particular history of Quenby Hall, room by room, generation by generation, as though determined to pass on every story the old stones held before her own time ran short. It was during one of these long, unhurried mornings that Lady Constance mentioned, almost in passing, a distant cousin of the family who had once fled scandal much as Alara had, and returned years later to find not judgment but welcome. And Alara understood, hearing it, that the pattern of fear and fairness she had lived through was older than her own story, woven deep into the fabric of the family she had married into. Edmund's work as magistrate continued much as it always had, careful and unhurried, though Alara noticed, watching him now with a wife's closer attention, a new gentleness in how he handled cases that touched on debt or desperation, a willingness to ask why before he asked how much, that had not been quite so pronounced before. When a young tenant farmer came before him that spring, accused of falsifying his own name to escape a cruel former employer 3 counties distant, Edmund listened to the man's full account with a patience Alara recognized intimately, and resolved the matter not with punishment, but with quiet, practical help finding honest work under his true name, a kindness that spread through the district's whispered conversations nearly as quickly as the old rumors about Alara's own arrival once had. Gerald Finch's fate, once resolved, was rarely spoken of at Quenby again, though word reached them occasionally through legal correspondence of his transport and eventual distant imprisonment. And Alara found she could hear his name now without the old cold grip of fear, only a faint, fading unease that time continued to soften with each passing season. By the following autumn, Alara had settled so completely into her new life that the anxious, careful woman who had once rehearsed her lies on the long road north from London felt almost like a stranger to her, someone she remembered with sympathy rather than shame. She walked the halls of Quenby freely now, without watching the windows for unfamiliar carriages, without flinching at unexpected knocks upon the front door, and when Nora, now thoroughly settled in her role and prone to gentle teasing now that formality between them had long since softened into genuine friendship, asked her one evening whether she ever missed the woman called Margaret Hale, Alara considered the question seriously before answering. "I do not miss her," she said finally, "but I am grateful to her all the same. She kept me safe long enough to become myself again." It was Lady Constance, in the final months of her long and eventful life, who offered Alara the observation she would carry with her longest, spoken one quiet evening as the old woman sat wrapped in shawls before the fire, her sharp eyes softened now by age and affection both. "You came to us under a borrowed name, my dear, believing it would protect you from a world too eager to judge, but it was never the name that protected you in the end. It was the courage to set it down and trust that the truth beneath it was worth loving." She reached out and patted Alara's hand with the same gentle, knowing touch she had offered on that very first anxious morning so long ago. "My nephew saw that truth in you long before you were ready to show it. I think, in the end, that has always been the rarest gift a person can offer another. Not simply patience, but the willingness to wait for someone to become fully themselves and to love what they find waiting there." Alara thought of those words often in the years that followed, through the quiet joys and small trials of a life built, at last, on honesty rather than concealment. She thought of them when her own children were born within the old stone walls of Quenby Hall, and when she watched Edmund carry each of them in turn, through the very gallery where he had first asked a frightened stranger where she hailed from and waited, with a patience that had changed the whole course of her life, for the truth to arrive in its own good time. She had come to Quenby Hall as Margaret Hale, a name built from fear and desperation, meant to disappear quietly into a house too grand and too watchful to ever truly welcome her. She remained there, for the rest of her days, as Alara Ashcombe, Duchess of Quenby, beloved wife and mother, cherished mistress of a household that had once terrified her and had become, in the fullness of time, the truest home she had ever known. And whenever new arrivals came to Quenby Hall in the years that followed, frightened or uncertain or carrying burdens of their own, it was often Alara herself who greeted them first, with the same gentle, unhurried patience that had once been extended to her, understanding better than most that a person's worst fear rarely deserved to be their final judgment, and that the truest kindness anyone could offer a stranger was simply the willingness to wait and to see them clearly, before deciding who they truly were.